Right, we're going to begin now with a look at the Romantic epic. That's the title of this course that I have chosen at any rate. It was once called Milton and the Romantics, and I changed it largely out of concerns that one of my colleagues had about the number of courses that reference Milton on our syllabus. I'm happy with either description, quite frankly, because really the centerpiece of the course is on the Romantic epics. But I do think that there was something of value in the previous description, namely Milton and the Romantics, because one of the things that we're going to look at on this course, in addition to the epic, is the figure of Milton himself and his significance to the Romantic poets. And Milton on multiple fronts. One of them is as an epic writer and an epic poet. And of course, epic poets are at the centerpiece of the Western tradition, and not just the Western tradition, of basically every literary culture. The epic seems to loom rather large in a culture's self-understanding. And it was certainly the case from the time of the Greeks with the great Homer, and following him or contemporaneous with him, Hesiod, Works and Days and Theogony, but Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. And then moving into the Roman period with Virgil and his great work, the Aeneid, or Ovid with his Metamorphoses, on through the ages. In the Anglo-Saxon tradition, we could look at works like Beowulf. It's certainly prominent in the great works of the Italian Renaissance, like in Dante's Divine Comedy. But in the figure of Milton, in the English literary tradition, we have the great writer of English literature, in my mind. Irrespective of what I think, it was the case in the minds of the authors of this Romantic period. They were regarded, both Milton and Shakespeare, as the two great writers of their own tradition, and yet it was Milton that they explicitly courted comparison with, and that was because he did write the grand epic. Now, Milton's grand epic was Paradise Lost, which is the story of the fall of mankind, an exploration of the themes and the context and the significance of the events told in Genesis 1 to 3, expanded on in Revelation 12, and so forth. But it wasn't just the epic that Milton wrote that interested the Romantic poets. It was Milton the man that was also of significance to the Romantic poets. And it's in part because of his involvement as a political figure. And so the context of Milton writing Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, Samson Agonistes are significant for these authors as well, because of course Milton writes in the time when England was, for the first time, declared to be a republic. And it did so against the backdrop of the beheading of the monarch of the day, Charles I, and the declaration of a republican government under the aegis of Oliver Cromwell, for whom John Milton served as Secretary of Tongues, which was the term used to draw upon Milton's vast capacity as a writer and his mastery of foreign languages. So Milton was effectively writing letters on behalf of the Cromwell's government, not just explaining but defending the conduct of Cromwell against a European landscape that was rather alarmed at the beheading of a lawful king, and worried, moreover, for the consequences for them. If England's king could be beheaded, and there could be an acceptance of this within the confines of England, then the monarchs of Europe were fearful that likewise could happen in their places of dominion. And so Milton served in that capacity. And with that in mind, the English Romantic poets, looking at their own age and their own beheading of a king, namely that of Louis XIV in France in 1789, was a similar, at least an analogous sort of framework. And so they saw Milton as not only their model as an epic poet, but as one who defended a republican government against the monarchy, which was reigning in their own day. So in that sense, the Romantics are political dissidents and also defenders of a form of political liberty against what they regarded as tyrannous oppression, much as Milton argued for the tyrannous oppression of Charles I. He suspended Parliament indefinitely at various points. He imposed a form of theological uniformity on the church, which Milton and many of the other Puritans of the day found simply unacceptable. And in the end, he revoked and went back on his word at numerous points, all of which led to the conclusion, not universally shared, but certainly widely enough to mount a fight against him amongst the Cavaliers, or rather the Roundheads, that Charles simply had to go. And we couldn't just depose him. He had to be removed lest his followers seek to replace him. So he was beheaded, and Cromwell sought to establish a republic in his wake, and did so for a decade or so. And then after he died, of course, the republic soon fell into ruin, and Charles II, who had been exiled into France, came back and restored the monarchy for at least a brief period of time, and Milton himself was placed under house arrest, during which, blinded though he was, he authored the three famous large works which have given him largely his poetic fame, namely the works Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and Samson Agonistes. But it was the first of these that was the primary model for writers that followed, one of the great poems of the English language. But it was Milton as the republican, as the political dissident, as well as the epic poet, which drew the admiration of the Romantics in their own era of political dissidence and of republicanism. And there was one final string in Milton's bow that I would say was significant to the writers of the period, and that was that he was a great defender of free speech. His famous tractate Areopagitica was a defense of freedom of speech in terms that very few would have shared in his day. It was written during the Cromwell government against the government's own attempt to suppress dissent. Milton argued that there ought to be freedom to publish one's opinions so that they would see the light of day, because, as Milton said, the truth will vanquish its opponents in a free and open battle, and this is good for the good of everyone, that the truth not be shackled by the bureaucrats. On the other hand, it wasn't unlimited scope for publishing one's views. He did think that having been subjected to the scrutiny of the public, that infamous, libelous, or seditious, or simply fallacious views could then be suppressed, but not before they were first uttered. So on that front, Mr. Milton was again a great role model to the Romantic poets, who were facing their own form of suppression. And remember, the context for, at least early on, the authors of the Romantic period, namely Wordsworth and Coleridge, and to some degree Blake, was the Napoleonic march across Europe, which led to a great deal of fear, not just in on the continent, but in England, that Napoleon's revolution could be exported to England, and so there was a crackdown on political dissent and so forth. So all of these are similar things, and they're things that were of great interest to the Romantic authors, and the reason why this course on the Romantic epic remains, as much as anything, a study of Milton as well as the Romantic poets. So it's Milton the man as well as the epic that he wrote, which is of interest here. Having said that, let me talk a little bit about something that I did mention just briefly there, namely the French Revolution, because it is the great historical backdrop against which we are going to need to understand the whole course. Now, as I said, oops, there we go. That's a bit of a problem when you bump. As I said, the political backdrop is must be understood as one of the primary things against which we understand the epic here. But I don't want to see and read these poetic attempts at epics in the Romantic period merely as political statements. There's much of a fashion, certainly amongst the new historicists and the critics of the Marxist tradition, of reading poetic texts merely as ideological or political treatises, which I simply don't agree with and think is, quite frankly, very limited in its grasp of what is there. I do believe that there is something distinctive about aesthetics and aesthetic appeal, that it's not merely another historical form of writing reducible to the context of the age, so that a great writer like Milton's poetic achievement could be placed on par with the scribblings of some obscure writer in the period, and all of them expressions of the spirit of the age. This sort of historicism, Marxist and materialist in its understanding, I think, is simply deleterious to all literary merit, and we may as well shut up shop if we're going to look at literature in that fashion. So I'm not going to do that. I am going to look at these Romantic epics as epics and not merely as expressions of the political ideology of the poets. But I'm also not going to discount the fact that the political backdrop is significant, not only in forming the opinions of the poets, but also as an expression of the distinctive features of the epic of the Romantic authors, and part of what makes their claim to be epic writers. So we're going to look at precisely that, the function of the epic for them. Now, historically in epics, the main function of the poetry is to stir the spirits of the warriors. These are usually products of warrior cultures, to similar heroic actions to that of the protagonist, whether it's Achilles in the Iliad, or Odysseus in the Odyssey, or of Aeneas in Virgil's Aeneid, or of Beowulf in the anonymous poem of the Anglo-Saxon epic. Or for that matter, we could say of Dante himself in his Divine Comedy, where Dante is like a pilgrim whose journey and whose character is exemplary for us. And finally, of course, we could consider Milton himself in Paradise Lost, and the model of heroism that he presents. Now, what's interesting about that, and I'm not going to speak too much about that here, is that Milton, to some degree, broke the mold of the epic in his writing of Paradise Lost, by making it, first of all, explicitly theological, but secondly, by subverting the understanding of what constituted heroism. In Book 9, he speaks of his epic subject matter no longer being that of knights and steeds and heroic battle, but rather of the relation of the soul to God, as a sort of an interior epic, an epic of faith and of character, rather than of physical deeds and of earthly battles. And so Milton's subversion of the historical classical heritage of epic depiction was revolutionary in itself, just as much as the beheading of Charles I and the replacement of the monarchy with a republic was revolutionary. So was his epic subject matter. And with that in mind, the Romantic epics have a similarly constituted understanding of their epic subject matter. So when we come to the epics of the Romantics, we're going to see that the epics are not of the sort of deeds being done and depictions of battles or scenes. It's more of an interior struggle, the struggle in this case of the mind, of the progressive imagination, as opposed to Milton's understanding of the relation of the soul to God. The Romantics will understand it as the emancipation of the mind from the shackles of prejudice, from that of custom, from that of even national historic consciousness, towards something like a marriage of the mind with nature. And that will be presented in various guises, and I will look at those ever so briefly now. But let me first of all turn here to the syllabus. Now, I was going to show you this, but then I just realized that I'm recording on YouTube rather than Zoom, so I cannot share the screen here. So I might have miscalculated in doing this way. But I will refer you to your class notes on that, which I have put up privately. But for the public here, I'm just going to go through the syllabus ever so briefly now, and we'll see whether I can manage to talk about that without actually showing you the subject matter. So the course is going to begin with a brief look at the most significant of the epic poets of the period, the author William Wordsworth. And we will look at his prelude, not in its full form, but in its earliest version, the so-called two-part prelude. I think it's interesting in and of itself. It has some literary merit, though not nearly the same literary merit as the finished work. But you can see in its earliest origins features of the epic and the subject matter that Wordsworth wanted to write upon and eventually did write upon. So we'll begin with a brief look at Wordsworth's two-part prelude, before then moving backwards in time to another document that doesn't seem at first blush to really relate to the Romantic epic. And yet I'm obviously, by including it on the course, saying that it is related to that. And it's an author who, interestingly, politically speaking, was simply categorically opposed to the political aims of the Romantic poets, namely the great English statesman Edmund Burke. Now, Burke was famous for his reflections on the revolution in France and his argument that the means by which the revolution was brought about, through violence, through insurrection, through anarchy, through disorder, was not the way in which the English had made their progress, in which freedom could flourish for long. So in some ways, Burke is speaking against the means by which Milton and his fellow Puritans had brought about or attempted to seize freedom. But we're not going to look at Burke in that treatise. That's the later political statesman, Burke's mature reflections. We're going to look at Burke in 1757, when he was a young man still cutting his teeth as a young public intellectual. And it's an aesthetic treatise, called A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origins of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful. And I'm going to take devote 2 classes to that, because it's my contention that the ideas of sublimity that Burke presents there, which refer explicitly to Milton's Paradise Lost as a representation of the sublime, particularly in his portrait of death in Book 2, lines 666 and following, was highly and vastly influential on the Romantics. And note, it's to some degree represented in the title, as cumbersome as it is. It's a philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and beautiful. Note the emphasis on the ideas. Burke, and I expanded on this in my History of Literary Theory course, my lectures on it, which are on my YouTube channel as well. Burke uses the language of John Locke here when talking about the origins of our ideas, and to some degree uses an empiricist account of these things, a very subjective account, and to my mind moves away from the traditional understanding of the sublime and the beautiful as objective, universal, and expresses them rather in psychological form, and to some degree as something that the human mind creates. Now, this shift to understand the utmost of beauty, or in Burke's disambiguation of sublimity as something that the mind itself creates as an idea, is a breach with the historic objective tradition of both the classical era and the Christian era. And I see it as absolutely decisive, not only to modern understandings, but particularly to the Romantics' own understandings. And I think you can see in the works that I haven't put on the course of Wordsworth and of Coleridge, an engagement with Burke's ideas. And these two terms, the sublime and the beautiful, are counters that many authors in the period will use, most famously Immanuel Kant, who read Burke's treatise and saw his distinction of the two, or his categorical distinction of these two terms, as absolutely crucial to his whole aesthetic system. But it's the subjective turn that's in Burke, and the disambiguation of sublime and beautiful, and the relation of the sublime to certain types of experience, that is going to prove to be crucial for the Romantics' own imaginative representation of sublimity. And that is the keynote of their claim to surpass Milton as an epic poet. It's the claim of the advance of the imagination in the progressive mindset over that of the theological objective presentation of Mr. Milton. So Edmund Burke for 2 weeks, and then we will move on, backtracking to what we began the course with, but in terms of chronology, to the great Romantic author William Wordsworth and his book, The Prelude. We'll spend 4 classes looking at that. And we will see Milton's Paradise Lost echoed in some ways in Wordsworth's Prelude, but of course Wordsworth makes the epic his own in these. And then we will take, in addition to Wordsworth's writings on the Prelude, which will be the main focus of our look at the Romantic epic, at least from Wordsworth's gaze, to some works by an author by the name of Whitreich, Joseph Anthony Whitreich. This is a collection of the works by the Romantics on Milton, and we will Whitreich very helpfully gathers together in this book everything that he could find by a variety of authors on the significance of Milton for them. And we'll look at some of the shorter writings, or from other places where Wordsworth reflects on Milton and his significance in various ways to his work. So we'll conclude with that before breaking for our reading week and Thanksgiving. And then we'll move on to Wordsworth's celebrated co-author of the lyrical ballads, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Now, Coleridge does not write an epic in the same sense that the rest of the authors on the course do. I'm looking at Coleridge primarily for his interest in the fusion of the feminine with the figure of Satan. Now, you'll recall, if you've read Paradise Lost, that, or have read the biblical account for that matter, that Satan tempts Eve, and Eve eats of the forbidden fruit in the garden before passing the fruit on to Adam. And it's that scene, which is the centerpiece of Book 9 in Paradise Lost, which is of great interest to not just Coleridge, but to many in this period, because, of course, this is seen as a scene of historical significance, but also of thematic significance. You can talk about the themes of freedom at this point. You can talk about the concepts of sin and of judgment, and of the alliance between the woman and the serpent. Coleridge presents it in his work Christabel in the form of a figure called a Lamia, which is a half woman, half serpent, historical mythological beast of the sort that the Greeks often used to describe. I'm not sure whether this would actually be a mythological creature, but in the same way that a sphinx is half lion, half man, something of both figures in a symbolic sense. And so Coleridge is, in his Christabel, reflecting on some sort of union between the serpent and the woman. And with that, to some degree, is expressing something that we will see reflected in this latest work by another author, Satanic Feminism. Now, that I'm not making a political statement here, I'm saying that feminism is satanic or something like that. But I am reflecting in saying this about Coleridge that there is an interesting connection in several of the Romantic authors, most notably here Coleridge, but also John Keats, of the idea that Lucifer, in some sense, is a liberator of woman in the culture of the period. And we can see this in the 19th and the 20th century. There's an odd, not explicitly Satanism in the Romantic presentation, but in some sense, symbolic alliance there of the woman against authority in general, which is presented as malign in the same way that the monarchy is presented as malign, and of the woman's seizing of the forbidden fruit as, in some sense, an emancipatory act. Anyway, Coleridge doesn't present it so heroically. He presents it as a horror scenario. So we'll look at that, as well as some extracts from Witchreich again by Coleridge, before moving on to, again, his poem France, an Ode. And then we'll move on backwards chronologically, but to the third of the first generation of Romantic authors, William Blake. We'll look at his Marriage of Heaven and Hell, as well as the part of his epic poem Milton. And if there were any doubt of how significant Milton was to the Romantic authors, entitling an epic after Milton is surely a demonstration that that is the case. But in the Marriage of Heaven and Hell, Blake is presenting his imaginative conception of what Milton disambiguates and says are categorically distinct. So Milton, in his theologically conservative historical understanding of heaven and hell, these are as far removed from one another and as far different from one another as can possibly be. In Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, he is presenting something other than the Great Divorce. And note that for those of you who did my C.S. Lewis course, Lewis's treatise, The Great Divorce, is a direct response to Blake's work, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. But Blake is trying to present a different view of creativity and poetry to that Milton himself represents, and in particular is bringing to the fore his idea of poetry as a fundamentally novel or original act without precedent. It does not seek to represent the past. It breaks with it entirely. It seeks absolute originality. And we'll look at that more carefully with Blake. But in Blake's expression here, we see something very common to the Romantic era, namely their utter divorce with the past, or their attempt to be utterly original in their imaginative representations of literature, which is a historically novel conception. The idea that poetry or artistry, in order to be deemed to be excellent or sublime, must of necessity be original. So not conventional in any sense, not using the models of the past, not using the stories of the past, not using the templates of the historic genres, not using the canvas of history of the world, not seeking to represent reality as it has been given, but rather to create that reality, as it were, ex nihilo. This is the claim of the Romantic authors. I personally think that the claim is absurd. And I personally think that the consequence of claiming this idea of originality is not only futile, but also in some sense is anarchic, and it destroys true creativity. And I'll give you an illustration of this, which I mentioned in my first year class. The 9 muses of the Greek understanding of creativity, and the 9 muses were the daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne, Mnesomyne, are the daughters of memory. And so, and the 9 muses were related to various arts. So Calliope was the goddess of the epic, but note that she was a daughter of memory. And the epic, the Iliad or the Odyssey, was remembered by the poet. And note that the inspiration of the muses upon which the poet called in order to tell his epic was drawing upon memory. So there was a huge belief in the classical era and everything up to the Romantic period that the fundamental basis for creative inspiration was simply a memory of what had happened before, and the individual's ability to recount that from memory and to do so very accurately. This was seen to be absolutely essential to all creative endeavor. So it was repeating what had happened, not simply trying to do something from ground zero, from a tabula rasa, to use John Locke's formulation. We're not going to begin with a blank slate, from ground zero, from a level playing field, as the English levelers of the English Civil War had said, or the French Revolutionaries had said. So in the day, it's interesting that after Louis XIV's head had been chopped off and the revolutionaries like Robespierre and so forth came to the fore, a reign of terror began, and there was a bloodletting because the revolutionaries who had executed the king were now in a position of authority. But what was their basis for the claim to be an authority? If Louis was not legitimate, why were they legitimate? And of course, there was no grounds of legitimacy that they could appeal to. And so the reign of terror went on until the strongman Napoleon came to the fore and put it all to an end. And when he did so, he didn't wholly tamp down the revolutionary fervor, though. In fact, he brought it about by means of the sword around Europe, and did bizarre things like seek to impose a 10-day 10-day week rather than a 7-day week, in order to be in line with the age of reason and the decimal system. So a more reasonable way of looking at the world, rather than one that had been passed on as an inheritance from the Christian era. The idea that God created the world in 7 days, and that weeks should be marked by 7 days, and that months should be 12, and so forth. So there's an attempt to reconstitute from ground zero the age of reason in accordance with the number 10 rather than the number 7. Well, all of these things are part and parcel with the Romantics' own notion of creativity, which should be rethought, reimagined in accordance with not with conventions, not with what was remembered, not with what was inherited, not with a reverence towards the past, but rather with the light of pure reason. And I think this marks all of the Romantics' writing. And for that reason, the Romantic epic is a study in the consequences, poetically speaking, of the age of enlightenment. And so we'll look at the many consequences of that as they're expressed in the poetry. So again, Blake's Marriage of Heaven and Hell and his poem Milton, and again, a few extracts from Witchreich, before moving on to a figure that I find enormously genial and interesting, although it's not per se an epic. It's more a meditation on the epic, and the meditation is that of a creature within the context of the story, and the author I'm thinking of here is Mary Shelley in her work Frankenstein. And just briefly, Frankenstein, the creature, having been spurned by his creator, a scientist, the mad scientist, Victor Frankenstein, having been spurned by his creator, flees into a country house, a farmhouse, and observes a family that loves one another and accepts one another. And he creeps into their farmhouse unbeknownst to them, and he reads nothing else than Milton's Paradise Lost. And in that story, sees himself and imagines what had happened to him and his rejection by his creator, and compares it and contrasts it with how Adam was created and loved by God. And he sees himself as a satanic figure. He says, I would have been an Adam had I been loved, but since I've been rejected and spurned and treated unjustly by the authorities, I will rather be a satanic figure to you. I will be like Lucifer. And so this forms the centerpiece of Mary Shelley's wonderful Gothic novel, Frankenstein. We'll look at that for 2 classes before moving on to her husband's little work on the devil and devils, in which he looks at it, the topic of the devil, from a sort of a historical, critical standpoint. He does look at the etymology of the word devil, its historic usage. It's a work of scholarship in many ways, a very interesting one, and fronts the idea, which is now relatively common, and I think incorrect myself, but still relatively common, that the devil is an invention of the church, and to some degree he is doing a historical archaeology of the idea of the devil. We'll look at that at any rate, because I think it's little read and quite important to the topic here. Before we will move on to a variety of his works, so everything from a few short works to his poem Mont Blanc being a sublime landscape, going back to what I said about Burke and the theme of sublimity, and then his attempt at the epic Prometheus Unbound. When I say it's an epic, in its earlier rendering, Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound, Aeschylus is not writing an epic. It's portrayed in a tragic play. But for Shelley, the Titan Prometheus, who is bound to the rock, who is also, by the way, the subtitle of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, this Titan who has been chained to the rock on the Caucasus Mountains and tormented by Zeus, becomes a sort of a liberator figure for mankind, and a heroic figure. And without giving too much away, Prometheus in Shelley's rendering breaks the chains of captivity, and he does so by forgiving Zeus in a really almost a Christian understanding of Christ's action in forgiving sin. Note that it happens without death and atonement and so forth, and all the implications, historic implications of the cross. But nonetheless, Shelley's talking about the theme of the power of forgiveness as an idea that the Romantics themselves will strongly hold to, and Shelley in particular. So I find this particularly fascinating as a Christian professor here. And then we'll move on to one of his contemporaries, Lord Byron. Now, Lord Byron is a fascinating figure in his own right, and his person is as interesting as his work. I believe it was Lady Hamilton that said he was mad, bad, and dangerous to know. He was notorious in his own life for an affair he had with his half-sister, or alleged to have had, which Byron himself did nothing to discourage. He loved the notoriety. He was the bad boy of the period. But he was a brilliant writer, I think. In some ways, one of the best authors of the period, and certainly on the continent, Byron and Shelley had greater acclaim than the first generation of Romantics. So Byron was much loved by Goethe in Germany, for instance, and he wrote a work called Cain. And again, drawing upon Milton's grand canvas and his theme of the fall of mankind, he dealt with the loss of Eden with Adam and Eve as the focus. Byron, on the other hand, will look at the next generation of human beings, namely Cain, and Cain will be the centerpiece of Byron's poetic portrait. Now, I will say one final thing before I move on, and that is that together Shelley and Byron were called the Satanic School by the critics of their day. I don't want to say that there was literally the charge that they were being Satanists, not that this charge is made by this author here, but rather that there was an intentional heterodoxy which was being promoted by both Byron and Shelley. Oh, by the way, Shelley wrote a tract while he was at University College, Oxford, called The Necessity of Atheism, which he distributed not only to the heads of all the colleges of Oxford, but to every bishop in England, for which he was expelled from the university. Because in those days, one had to be Anglican in order to study at Oxford. And so he was, again, a rebel, but the young Shelley was a man of conviction. At any rate, we'll move from Byron, and we will conclude with some looks at John Keats. 3 works, 2 attempted epics in Hyperion and the Fall of Hyperion, and then finally his work Lamia, which is about a half woman, half serpent, and again very much like Shelley Coleridge's Christabel, very much modeled upon that, but expanding on that in many ways. And what we see in Keats's epic is a full expression of progressivism, and I would say a full expression of the idea of evolution in an ideological framework. And it's really interesting to me that we can see a full-blooded poetic representation of the idea which was represented by Charles Darwin in scientific terms, but about 50 years before Darwin expresses it, which has led me to think that the idea of, and not just me, but C.S. Lewis, to say that there's something about the idea of the scientific idea of evolution, which is more of a poetic fancy than it is actually a purely scientific observation, as per the methodology of empirical science. But without going too far down that path, that will constitute the subject matter of the course. And we will explore all of those works. We'll talk about their interplay back and forth. But I look forward to exploring those grand themes, the ideas from various authors expressed in various ways. And we can talk about how they have become not so much original in our day, but rather they are now the seen as the standard way of looking at the world, this idea of the divorce from the past, of an emancipatory act of humanity from theological shackles, is represented in the Romantics' epic works and in their understanding of creativity. All of those subject matters will be at the heart and the center of this course. At any rate, I shall see you next class and look forward to that then, when we look at, once again, William Wordsworth's two-part prelude. And I shall see you then. Thank you.